You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynne Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Friday the 15th of March. Halal or not halal? Pork DNA in Church of England school sausages. Barking men accused of running child prostitution ring. Poor UK work ethic partly to blame for EU migrants' influx. Just two instances where NHS waste £20 million on PR and advisers. At the same time, the Yorkshire Post headlines anger over £6 million taxpayer bill for NHS advisers. Lord Ahmed, a shining example of Islamic tolerance. Qatar's shopping spree includes Europe's politicians. Islamists target Germany's pro-NRW party leader. Germany bans 3 radical Islamo-fascist Salafist groups. Nick Alice in Wonderland Griffin, MEP. Christians unsafe at Muslim conference. Boy Scout asks members if gays would be okay. Thought for the day, the Greek conundrum and what are our juries playing at. And finally, the uneducatable chasing the inedible. UK news. Halal or not halal? Pork DNA in Church of England school sausages. All major news sources are reporting on pork contamination of halal products and meals, and according to BBC London, a DEFRA spokesman has said it is totally unacceptable if food labelled as halal has been found to contain pork. All this clamour is in the wake of the latest scandal whereby halal sausages at St Mary Bryanston Square, a Church of England school in Westminster, were found to contain pork meat. This latest report of halal or not halal food follows the pork contamination of halal packaged meats for the prison service. World Today believes the real story is that a Christian school in particular, a Church of England school, shouldn't even be catering for or serving halal products, when the consumers, the children, have no choice at all. Christians are forced to eat halal, since there's no requirement by DEFRA or any other government agency for food to be labelled halal or non-halal. And once again the rights of the immigrants trump the rights of the general public. Barking men accused of running child prostitution ring. The Barking and Dagenham Post report. 2 men from Barking have been accused of running a child prostitution ring in East London. Naeem Ahmed, 25, and Hassan Raza, 23, both of Westminster Gardens, denied a string of sex offences at Snaresbrook Crown Court on Friday the 8th of March 2013. Ahmed denies 6 counts of rape, 1 count of controlling a child prostitute, 1 count of inciting child prostitution and 1 count of paying for the sexual services of a child. Raza denies a single count of sexual assault. Anas Iqbal, 25, of Newnham Way, East Ham, and Nabil Ahmed, 24, of Chadwell Heath Lane, Romford, also denied charges. The trial, listed for June the 3rd, is expected to take between 4 and 8 weeks. World Today comments, a gun and a wall are much cheaper. Poor UK work ethic partly to blame for EU migrants' influx. Public Service Europe reports on a recent study by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development of 1,000 employers, and 16 case studies have found that some British companies prefer migrant workers from the European Union for low-paid jobs. The results of the study, published as the State of Migration Employing Migrant Workers, puts this down to their perceived superior work ethic, technical skills and long-term commitment to roles, including their willingness to work antisocial hours. Employers are putting these requirements above any positives that may have come from employing staff born inside the United Kingdom. The practice of job referrals, where employees recommend friends, relatives and other associates, and the role played by recruitment consultancies favouring EU workers, were also highlighted as measures that had perhaps resulted in prejudice against British people. Another factor was a perception of a relatively high turnover rate among UK-born workers, said CIPD. Employers report that migrant workers tend to set themselves a frame of reference that says, I'll stick at this low-skill job for 2 or 3 years, it isn't my long-term career plan. something that means turnover is lower than for UK-born younger workers. On average, the share of migrant workers in private sector firms was 11%, higher than in the public sector organisations at 3%, the CIPD research revealed. Of those employers that employed migrant workers, around 1 in 20 private sector companies reported that at least half of their workforce was made up of migrant workers. Just 2 instances where NHS waste £20 million on PR and advisors. NHS London PR spend criticised as it spends nearly £13 million on public relations in the last 3 years. A Freedom of Information request by the BBC revealed press officer salaries accounted for £9.7 million, with another £3 million going to PR companies. There are currently 82 press officers on the NHS public payroll, with an average salary of £37,270 each. Catherine Murphy, Chief Executive of the Patients Association, told the broadcaster far too many patients experience longer waiting times, cancelled operations and standards of care below what they deserve. These figures are a concerning example of the cost of NHS PR. It is sadly patients paying the price. Many will ask whether this funding will be better spent on medical doctors rather than spin doctors. And at the same time, the Yorkshire Post headlines anger over £6 million taxpayer bill for NHS advisors. The NHS regulator Monitor, who has spent a third of their budget on finance and management consultants, was blasted and branded a gravy train by a senior MP amid criticism over the increasing role of private sector consultants in the NHS. Between April and January, Monitor paid £6.35 million for a range of projects from its £9.5 million budget. Among reports are 2 into the future of the Rotherham and Barnsley NHS trusts, which bosses at both have dismissed as inaccurate. NHS officials have refused to make them public, but the Yorkshire Post understands they raise doubts about the long-term finances of both. Former Shadow Health Secretary John Healey, MP for Wentworth and Dearne, said Monitor is a consultancy gravy train for these big firms. Monitor is first and foremost about finance, and it's now doing a job for the government under its reorganisation of the health service to set the NHS up as a market in the long term. These reports are not about health needs or standards of care, they're simply about finances. Lord Ahmed, a shining example of Islamic tolerance. We have this bit of good news via Channel 4. Labour peer Lord Ahmed was suspended by the Labour Party after claims his imprisonment for dangerous driving was due to the pressure placed on the court's Jews, who own newspapers and TV channels. The Muslim peer allegedly told an Urdu language broadcast in Pakistan that the judge who jailed him was appointed to the High Court after helping a Jewish colleague of Tony Blair during an important case. He allegedly claimed that his imprisonment was related to Jewish disapproval of his support for Palestinians in Gaza, which he visited in 2008. This is the second time in a year Lord Ahmed has been suspended by the Labour Party. He was suspended for 3 months last year over reports that he offered a $10 million bounty for the capture of US President Barack Obama and his predecessor George Bush. World date. One has to love this shining example of Islamic tolerance from a Labour peer. European news. Qatar's shopping spree includes Europe's politicians. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy is to join former British Prime Minister Tony Blair as a Qatari consultant. From Islam versus Europe, we learn of the Financial Times story about Sarkozy being mooted as the head of a €500 million fund backed by Qatar. And examining the financial interests of prominent European politicians gives every reason to believe that the Arabs, and particularly the Qataris, are pursuing a deliberate strategy of cultivating ties to our political elites. Yes, it's not just islands and football clubs the Arabs are buying. Qatar's Sovereign Wealth Fund and other investors have offered to commit as much as €500 million in total to a fund run by the former French president. However, with President Hollande sinking in popularity, he sees an opportunity to return to politics and has placed discussions on hold. The Qataris are taking an option on the next president of France. An individual person with a knowledge of the venture is reported to have told the Financial Times. This is far from exceptional. Tony Blair is regularly employed by Qatar as a consultant and middleman, and just a few months ago it was reported that Berlusconi was considering selling a 30% stake in AC Milan to Qatar's sovereign wealth fund. World Date says, talk about the Illuminati and the New World Order, I think we're looking right at it. Islamists target Germany's pro-NRW party leader. The local Germany's News in English reports German police foiled an Islamist assassination plot against the head of the pro-NRW North Rhine-Westphalia party. The authorities arrested 4 members of the radical Salafist group before they could murder Markus Beseich, who the local describe as xenophobic, anti-Muslim and far-right. This presenter says he sounds like my type of guy. The police apprehended 2 of the suspects in Leverkusen near Cologne, where they were apparently observing Beseich. 2 others were arrested in Essen and Bonn, where the police discovered ingredients to make explosives and a gun. The arrests prove that the security authorities are vigilant and take the threat from extremist Salafists very seriously, said NRW Interior Minister Ralph Jaeger, according to the website of Der Spiegel. The Bild newspaper reported that one of the arrested men was involved in a failed bomb attack on Bonn's main train station in December the 10th, 2012. Germany bans 3 radical Islamo-fascist Salafist groups. From Bare Naked Islam on the local Germany's News in English report, Germany has just announced that it banned 3 radical Muslim Salafist groups, which officials say were advocating the overthrow of Germany's democratic system to be replaced with Sharia Islamic law. Global Post, the Interior Ministry, said the bans, which come amid stepped-up observation of the Salafist community in Germany, took effect early Wednesday in the western states of Hesse and North Rhine-Westphalia. The targeted organisations are the Dawa FFN and the Islamisch Audios, as well as the An-Nusra, which is part of the Millatu Ibrahim group that was already banned in June, a ministry statement said. Searches were carried out at the homes of 20 people and property was seized, it added. Interior Minister Hans-Peter Friedrich said the groups were seeking in an aggressive, militant way to change society in which democracy is to be replaced by a Salafist system and the rule of law by Sharia. At the time of the Millatu Ibrahim network ban, hundreds of police raided more than 70 homes, schools and mosques across the country in a clampdown on what one official described as dangerous extremists. It's not immediately clear how many members are in the 3 groups which are banned on Wednesday, but German authorities estimate that there are about 4,500 Salafists in the country. They espouse an austere form of Sunni Islam, but officials in Germany accuse them of also condoning violence against state institutions. The Salafists raised concern last year with their drive to convert non-Muslims, a campaign that involved handing out 25 million copies of the Koran in Germany, Austria and Switzerland. I now hand you over to Nick Alice in Wonderland Griffin MEP.
I think I begin to realise how Alice felt in Wonderland. Only in my case, the hallucinogenic rabbit hole this week dropped me into a warren of semi-Marxist weirdness in Strasbourg. In the middle of Tuesday's votes, for example, a commissioner stood up and started making a long statement about the Commission's glorious plan. He didn't make it clear if it was a 5-year one, and how it had ended the financial crisis. The old hand nationalist told me afterwards that commissioners aren't supposed to launch rambling monologues during voting sessions, and that they'd never seen such a thing done before, but that doesn't qualify as weird by EU standards. What was surreal by anybody's standards was the way in which he kept trying to convince us, or perhaps himself, that the crisis has indeed been dealt with. It made for stunningly boring listening, and halfway through his long speech, MEPs from the alcoholic wings of the various groupings began to look at their watches and fidget and twitch as it dawned on them that they were looking at a very late lunch. On and on the Commissioner droned, telling us all the different initiatives, initials and acronyms that had been used in the battle against the crisis. Fidgeting and grumbling gave way to actual barracking, in which I was pleased to take part, because these people take themselves far too seriously, and a bit of straight talking relieves the tedium. "You can rearrange the deck chairs, but it's still sinking," I called out, provoking a real burst of laughter from the UKIPers and Tories sitting in the rows in front of me, until they turned round and realised who was responsible for the irreverence. The weirdness continued during the voting on the EU's financial plans for 2014 to 2020. Over the previous few days, my constituency inbox had been swamped by voters lobbying against the proposal in the main report to run votes on the plan as secret ballots. All were furious at the idea of MEPs from tax and spend parties hiding their support for such unpopular decisions by making the votes anonymous. One of the leaders of the Socialist bloc rose to explain that, while she and her colleagues, including your very own Labour MEP, were all in favour of transparency and openness, they couldn't support the amendment calling for a rejection of the secret ballot proposal, because the same procedure wasn't being followed everywhere. British Conservative group leader Martin Callanan rose to respond, and, fair play to him, ripped the silly woman and her socialist hypocrisy to shreds. I'm still not sure which was the most weird, the socialist's threadbare yet twisted excuse for refusing to accept the clearly expressed public desire for openness in EU funding matters, or finding myself applauding a Tory. It got even stranger by Thursday, when Clive Jefferson, travelling with me for discussions with our colleagues in the Alliance of National Movements, reported back from a morning at a special hearing of the Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee. The meeting was convened to debate the Giannanco report into the statute and funding of European political parties and political foundations. Amid scenes worthy of the court of Wonderland's Red Queen, the Socialist bloc tried desperately to force through various amendments that they dropped in more or less at the last minute. They're particularly keen to create a gang of 4 wise men, their hand-picked friends of course, to sit in judgment on pan-European parties, in particular the Alliance, declare them to be lacking in commitment to core European values, such as democracy or the European Union, and prevent them from registering to stand in elections. Even more sinister is the proposal to pass a special law to defend democracy and justice by preventing any party they decide to ban from being permitted to appeal to the European Court. You can vote for any party as long as it's approved. Strikes me that elderly Czechs, for example, will remember elections held with similar rules in 1948 in Czechoslovakia after the communist takeover. 1948, of course, was also the date which George Orwell used to produce the title of his famous warning against totalitarianism, 1984. Orwell addressed the same theme in Animal Farm. He would have understood at once what kind of creatures are being bred by the still unfinished European project. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. We're now working on an emergency campaign whereby you can help lobby the members of the Constitutional Affairs Committee before they vote on these appalling proposals next Tuesday. Thanks to the recently revamped website of the Alliance of European National Movements, this campaign will have an international reach. But having large numbers of foreigners, even good ones, emailing in defence of freedom and democracy is no substitute for us Brits doing it. So I hope very much that you will join everyone else emailing the AFCO MEPs, urging them to reject the far left's plan to save democracy by destroying it. We'll be publishing all the information you need very shortly on our website. I kept the most bizarre thing of all till last. Towards the end of voting yesterday, there was a report on match fixing. Now, while I enjoy various normal human vices, I don't gamble. I regard the lottery as a special tax for idiots. Though, if you do by chance hit the Euro jackpot this weekend, I do hope you'll remember the BNP. More seriously, I believe that the last Labour government's decision to allow its cronies in the gambling industry to build casinos and spread bookish shops with highly addictive gaming machines to every high street in Britain was one of the worst of all Blair and Brown's betrayal of working class families who can ill afford to lose the kind of sums that are clawed from the pockets of their countless victims. But I also believe in freedom of choice, and that an overmighty state is invariably even more dangerous to human dignity and happiness than the folly of individuals and things like the gambling industry. So I had no trouble knowing how I would vote when Simon Darby drew my attention to a proposal to outlaw gambling. Yes, to ban all gambling. Proposal put forward by the Nordic Green Left Group, whose MEPs include the convicted IRA Sinn Féin bomber, Martina Anderson. The Irish, of course, are renowned for their love of horse racing and the betting that goes with it. The IRA, you may remember, kidnapped and killed one racehorse, Shergar. Had this red-green Sinn Féin madness been accepted, then their political wing, by forcing gambling underground, would have caused the slaughter of thousands more. In all probability, they never thought the proposed ban through. The law of unintended consequences, however, is as inexorable as the law of gravity, and it is in particular triggered with special ferocity in the case of utopian projects such as the European Union. Yet, while the consequences of such hubris may be unintended, that doesn't make them any less dire, as we shall see in the months and years ahead. I'll keep you posted.
Thank you, Nick. A fascinating insight into the European Union, or down the white rabbit hole. World news. Christians unsafe at Muslim conference. From Australian Herald Sun's Andrew Bolt's blog, a Christian writes about the Islamic Peace Conference in Melbourne that invited a bunch of hate preachers. Some Christians who had approval to hire a stall giving away Bibles at the Islamic Peace Conference at the Melbourne Showgrounds this weekend have now had this approval withdrawn. The Christians from various churches around Melbourne had been offered a 6 by 3 metre stall for $600. The Islamic Research and Educational Academy, IREA, contacted them last night and said that the Bible stall could not go ahead because it would be unsafe. The Christians were told that, due to expected anti-Islamic protests outside the showgrounds, IREA could not guarantee their safety. An IREA spokesman, who identified himself as Sammy, was concerned about radical elements amongst the Muslim attendees taking it out on the Christians, and said that the IREA security personnel could not protect the Christians. They also claimed they had consulted Victoria Police about security and had come to this decision. Another Christian group was told last night that all the stalls had been allocated and there was no room left. According to the IREA website, there are over 200 stalls available, but their stall map shows only 44 stalls have been hired so far. Boy Scouts asked members if gays would be okay. From WND.com we learn the Boy Scouts of America are to ask the boys and their parents, do you mind if a homosexual leader camps overnight with the boys? Ahead of a historic vote, the Boy Scouts of America has issued a survey asking Scouts and their parents if they could accept various scenarios that would arise if the organisation changes its century-old policy and allowed homosexuals in its membership. The survey presents scenarios ranging from a lesbian leader of first-grade boys to a gay male troop leader who takes adolescent boys on an overnight camping trip. The BSA's National Council of some 1,400 members is expected to vote on the proposed policy change at its annual meeting in Grapevine, Texas, in May. Thought for the day. The Greek conundrum and what are our juries playing at? My thought today is one for the weekend and centres around Muslim gang perpetrated sexual abuse on minors and rumours coming out of Greece. The first one are the rumours coming out of Greece and whether we in the rest of Europe should be worried. There is a YouTube video going around showing the riots and unrest that have been previously unreported and the steps which the Greek government appear to be taking. The mercenary militia group Blackwater, who operated in Iraq and Afghanistan, have been brought into Greece by the authorities. Blackwater is notorious. A private mercenary army, it first came to the public attention in 2003, 2 years after it was founded, when the US government contracted it to provide military support for the war in Iraq. Innumerable scandals followed, and now the Greek government has enlisted its services for domestic duties. They have also been used in Afghanistan. There are fears from the Greek general population that Blackwater and its personnel are being used to stoke the fires of discontent amongst the people, and when the people riot, they will then be fighting in the streets, and when Greece lies burning, the government will blame the so-called fascist Golden Dawn and bring it down, thus raising the flag for so-called democracy in Greece, or rather the socialist Marxist flag. There are a couple of very interesting comments sent in and I shall quote, "Golden Dawn is not the problem. A coup is what is necessary in Greece. The elites are scared because they've lost control of the people and the authorities. Don't believe the media lies. The people stand behind Golden Dawn while CIA-sponsored leftist terror groups are pushing us into civil war." Tsipras and Soros have a good relationship, and one which I found interesting. Golden Dawn is a nationalist party, not a fascist party. Among that they have a huge support from the people along with the military and the police. which of course is true. Golden Dawn are a nationalist party and could teach other European nationalist parties a thing or two. They do very good work amongst their own people who they look after, and they feed the poor and help the people in their own communities. I personally have a lot of respect for Golden Dawn. But of course, saying that, they are and will be the objects of persecution from the left-wing and Marxist factions. The right and left wings of politics will never live alongside one another, much like the Muslims and anyone else of a different religion. Never the twain shall meet. Golden Dawn have, according to some people, infiltrated the police and army and are therefore a threat to the government, who seem to have brought in the heavy brigade to sort things out. The trouble is that when you bring in paid strangers to any country to sort it out, it never works out that way. It is a case of too many cooks stirring the pot, and never ends well, as we most likely will see from Syria and the potential for disaster there, including the man-made Islamist democracy that will rise from these ashes, which will still remain ashes for the next umpteen years. Poor Assad. If only he had been a mad mullah with a host of shrouded wives, the West wouldn't have interfered. Back to Greece and their unfortunate condition. Perhaps our media will print stories of Blackwater and the goings-on there, including the unlawful killings of Greek citizens, or troublemakers as they're classed, but I doubt it. It will revert back to the usual journalist ethics of bad-mouthing the fascist Golden Dawn and laying all the ills of Greece, to which no small part is owned by the Greeks themselves and their tax laws, at the door of Golden Dawn and the classic headline, The Rise of the Far Right. Oh, if only. Talking about our media, and I frequently do, there was another Muslim grooming case which has just finished and which never hit the news headlines on TV, which is, let's face it, the doorway to millions of lugholes attached to millions of brains, hopefully. It was reported in the Telegraph some weeks ago when the men, Muslim, not Asian, were arrested. The Norwich Crown Court heard that 3 men abducted a troubled 13-year-old and forced her to become their sex slave after plying her with drugs and moving her from London to Ipswich over the course of 4 days. It's apparent from the court hearing that the basic subject of her being only 13 years old has completely escaped the jury. Nowhere is it mentioned that these men have been prosecuted for rape of a minor, which alone carries a severe penalty, and putting their names on the sex offenders list. They are being prosecuted for, wait for it, trafficking, rape and passing Class B drugs to a victim. They also harp on the troubled family angle. In reality, she was allowed to live with her father because her mother was unable to look after her. So she wasn't in a children's home or on the streets. She did have at least one parent. How troubled do these youngsters have to be to invite this sort of abuse? To name and shame, although it won't, these bastards are Surinuddin, 28, of St Matthew's Row, Bethnal Green, London; Mohammed Sheikh, 31, of Seaton Point in Hackney, London; Hamza Ali, 38, of Chilford Road, Waltham Forest, London; and a new one, Abdul Hamid, 46, of Wellington Street, Ipswich, obviously the guy who rented the house for their crimes. All have denied various sex offences during a 3-week trial. But get this one, it took the jury 3 days of thinking about it, and even then, Uddin, Sheikh and Ali were all found guilty of conspiracy to traffic in the UK and supplying a Class B drug to a victim. Uddin was also convicted of 2 counts of rape. Sheikh was convicted on a charge of causing a child to engage in sexual activity but was cleared of 2 counts of rape. Ali was found guilty of a sexual assault but not guilty of rape. The men will be sentenced at a later date. Abdul Hamid was cleared of supplying a Class B drug and 2 counts of rape. The judge had early instructed the jury to find him not guilty of trafficking. The similarity to the Oxford case is apparent, as are all these cases. Well, the ones that have been reported in a typical airy-fairy PC way, of course. Somehow these papers make it seem almost normal that an 11-year-old child in the Oxford case was branded with a heated hairpin on her bum to make it apparent she was owned by one of her abusers. And people think slavery started and ended with the British and the Africans. Think again, people. This is what's happening in our country now with our young women and children. And whatever the Mail, the Telegraph and the rest print, it can never cover what has actually happened to these children. You have the evidence in black and white now that the press, the media, the police and the courts will never mete out the sort of justice that these perverts deserve. That of hanging or castration, or to make matters simple, deportation with their families back to the countries that would hopefully deal out a rough kind of justice. But of course they wouldn't, because it isn't their children being abducted and abused. Under the law of Islam, no one who is non-Muslim counts, and I mean counts even as a human being. We are less than dogs to them. However they may sugarcoat it, that is what the truth of the matter is. And it would appear that our juries are taken from either their own ethnic communities, or from just other ethnics, or from liberal Marxist white lovies. In the Ipswich trial it would be interesting to see just how long these monsters get in our comfy jails with their prayer rooms and special food and numerous and expensive appeals thrown in. I know my listeners know exactly what I would do with them, so I will not ruin their weekend with details. It's still blindingly obvious which way the pendulum of justice is swinging over these crimes. The courts have not mentioned the religious and cultural aspect of all these sorts of grooming crimes, that of Muslim on non-Muslim, and if one goes to the racism angle, black on white, although the girls are not named or pictured and could be from any ethnicity, so one cannot be sure. But in all, these reported cases, the softly approach is given even in court. Now, if it was a nationalist crime of sexual slavery, abduction and abuse of underage Muslim girls, the court would be packed, there'd be rioting in the streets, there'd be an investigation in Parliament as to how this could happen in Britain today, and the papers would be dining out for the next 10 years on this one. And I can just see the dribble running down Andrew Norfolk's chin as he salivates, in private of course. What I wonder is, when we get the awful influx of Romanians and Bulgarians, who are well known for their women and girl trafficking, do you think there'll be a turf war of what does or has whom or what in what area of our country? Already the Romanians have been warned not to go to London because there are too many parkies there. So that means they'll go to areas like Ipswich and around the home counties, who might yet enjoy the enrichment of Muslim and Romanian traffickers and perverts. As we can see from the Oxford debacle, these bastards travel, much like Have Child Will Travel or Every Hole is a Money Bag, and they will travel more as we get poorer, these people get richer, on the backs of our youth. Make no mistake, if there wasn't money involved, either in the supply of property, drink and drugs, no Muslim worth his salt would get involved. It is very much like rape. It isn't the sexual angle, it's the power that goes with it. And I feel that the powers that be in our country are encouraging a whole new generation of psychopathic rapists and serial killers on an enormous level, and indeed on an ethnic and religious level, to perpetrate crimes for which we cannot fight against for our own indigenous peoples. They are targeting underage girls. Why? There's more money in virgins and they are less likely to be diseased. Well, that is when they get them, as they will end up diseased after time. They attack the vulnerable, like hyenas, the ones lagging behind the pack, and it's obvious why. They won't yell, they won't tell, and they will be grateful. They have the ability to travel long distances, rent or use existing properties in the Islamic network for a base, and the power to render local police and individuals virtually blind to what is going on and has been for many, many years. So all in all, David Attenborough could do a TV show on these Muslim perverts under the title Predatory Species, and I wish they could be subjected to being hunted for ivory or rhino horn, but there's nothing one would want for them in reality, so no go there. Just think if these few cases had been reported and prosecuted, albeit in a very minor way, just how many have not. It could be happening in a shop, house or flat near you. If you have any information that could be used, or we can help anyone, do ring the Profam number 02476 980 768 or email me at natsec@profam.org.uk. Fear is not an option, any more for you or for us. And finally, the uneducatable chasing the inedible. My weekend funny probably isn't funny, but you have to see the funny side. I watched the video of a car driving up and blocking a small residential road in Birmingham, and then a horde of fuzzy-headed guys in tracksuits running towards it. I say fuzzy because the people making the film have tried to block out, or rather black out, the ethnicity of the runners and not succeeding, as most were obviously black or Asian or both or whatever. This almost shocking scene took place at 8:30 on a weekday morning near a nursery school. 40 years ago there would have been people going to work, school, shops and not an ethnic in sight, but now this small street has become the norm for most large cities in our country. The driver of this car was dealing in Class A drugs, that is heroin, crack cocaine, ecstasy and more, bad drugs, addictive drugs and very expensive drugs. Most if not all the buyers were small dealers who would go on and sell outside schools and in cafes and clubs. The film formed part of the BBC series Caught Red-Handed, and the footage shows about 30 addicts running towards a drug dealer's vehicle just seconds after it pulled up in a street in Bordesley Green, Birmingham. West Midlands Police released the clip after 29 men were sentenced to prison as part of Operation No Deal. DCI Nick Walton said, "You'd imagine drug transactions are carried out in a discreet manner, but the footage we obtained shows around 30 people rushing towards the dealer's car in broad daylight. I've never seen anything like it in my police career. It was clear we needed to take decisive action to tackle the problem. No one should be expected to put up with drug dealing on their doorstep. This presenter says I can think of at least a couple of ways to deal with this problem. Long term." You've been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynne Mozart, and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and a very safe weekend.